liberation. So again, I will read the statement by the Combahee River Collective. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. A historical understanding of policing and prisons makes it clear that we need to go beyond small reforms, that institutions that primarily have control over Black and Indigenous people, poor people, people with mental health issues, people who've been sexually abused, that these institutions are not the appropriate way to address issues of racial injustice, of economic injustice, and social injustice. I think it makes very clear the need to move toward the horizon of abolition. And I mean that in a broad sense, in terms of the need to invest instead in decent housing and community building, instead of caging people who are marginalized, or instead of shooting people who are marginalized, instead of shooting somebody in a mental health crisis. And I think if we take the experiences of Black women into account, it makes it even more clear that what it takes to fight for justice and what we mean by abolition becomes far more broad. It makes it clear that policing and safety are not necessarily interlinked, that we need to think about alternative kinds of safety. It actually pushes us towards more radically transformative possibilities. What would it look like for us to be as outraged by the intrusion of social services into Black women's homes and the unsubstantiated removal of their children, to cast it at least as serious as the unwarranted arrest of driving, walking, and living while Black? I think that it's really important for us, as we're coming up against such a difficult time when we are reacting to so much, to build this deeper analysis of policing and profiling and punishment more broadly into our movements for racial justice. Now, to bring us back again to that statement, though, it's not only then Black people would be free, but it's that this would dismantle all forms of oppression. And I think that that's something that, again, we can really think about and we can really take apart a little bit. Because if we look at the ways in which anti-Black racism has actually been used in our society, we realize that it has been used to harm well beyond Black women, well beyond Black people. But this is actually something that has been used to justify harms against a pretty broad array of people in Canadian society. In this upswing that we're having towards possible fascism, white supremacy has very little to offer beyond the privileges that are often imaginary, if powerful, that are accorded to whiteness, the privilege of being better than, but it has no liberatory potential. Upholding racism has not protected even respectable upper middle class white women from the backlash to the Me Too movement, right? There are very little protections, there is very little freedom being promised by the white lash. But to attend to the barriers preventing Black women's freedom and Black people's freedom would stand to substantively improve Black people's lives. And it would actually really make important improvements in the ways that we conceive of our society. Because, for example, the broad sweeping punitive possibilities within welfare fraud were justified by the pathologization of Black women, but they impact poor people and poor women. And people of all genders in a significant way, right? It's a significant intrusion into anybody who is poor's liberty. The ways that Black people were used to drive the war on drugs, both in the early 20th century and again in the 1980s into the present. We are seeing right now that there is significant collateral damage to what has been done under the rubric of anti-Black racism, as we're seeing literally thousands of people dying in an overdose crisis that was never intended to protect people from drugs, but was always a mechanism of racialized control. We see that the ways that anti-Blackness, now I didn't speak about this today, but was really used to further the ability to deport migrants who've been committed of even very minor crimes. From the 90s, it was used in a backlash of a shooting that really brought forward a significant amount of anti-Black racism in the media. But now that makes it possible for any migrant, including white Americans and Europeans convicted of a minor crime, for example, to be removed from this country, right? So these punitive webs and these carceral webs that continue to expand, that are so often justified by Black people's so-called criminality, are things that are actually impacting society more broadly. So it's necessary for all of us, when we're thinking about what it means to fight for Black people's freedom, to remember that this is actually about all of us trying to imagine a world not based on these forms of punishment, that of course impact so many beyond Black communities and Indigenous communities. I think it also allows us to conceive of the fact that we're not asking for proportionate death at the hands of police or proportionate incarceration, right? We're not asking for a racially equitable distribution of state violence. that what this struggle is about ending state violence completely, right? And that's why I think to say and believe and to act as if Black Lives Matter, as if all Black Lives Matter, is actually an alternative epistemology. It's not just a response to police brutality, but it's an assertion of the possibility of a different world, one that we are willing into existence in our everyday practice. And I think that what has been really grounding me recently is remembering that it is this fear of that different world, the one that we're working towards right now in many ways, that is at the heart of the white lash. It's no surprise that the global rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada, I don't know more, in the United States, Standing Rock, Arab Spring, of mass feminists mobilizing in Brazil, these incredibly powerful people's uprisings globally are representing an important threat to the status quo. So I spoke in the opening remarks about the need to make racists afraid again, which, as I said, is a valuable goal. But I think in this statement, to make racists afraid again, we're overlooking something very important. And I was reminded of this by Caribbean revolutionary historian theorist Robert Hill, who spoke here last Saturday, when he reminded us that the white lash itself is coming from a place not of strength, but of fear. And I remember, I keep coming back to this very memorable essay written by Toni Morrison in the wake of Donald Trump's election, called Making America White Again. And I think it speaks very well to the present moment, so I'll just read a short excerpt. The sad plight of grown white men crouching beneath their better selves to slaughter the innocent during traffic stops, to push Black women's faces into the dirt, to handcuff Black children. Only the frightened would do that, right? These sacrifices, made by supposedly tough white men who are prepared to abandon their humanity out of the fear of Black men and women, suggest the true horror of lost status. The horror of lost status, the fear that is really motivating this global white lash, is something that is somehow moving really so many more than the fear, that very real fear of imminent climate and planetary collapse. So when Morrison speaks to these sacrifices that are being made, these sacrifices are very real. It's sacrificing the future of those who are in power's own children and grandchildren in order to preserve the status, not even many of the material gains, but the status of whiteness. Whiteness, the political project, that is, the structure. So in order to fight for the preservation of this status, it is asking enormous sacrifices of those that are undergoing this fight. We're seeing this after the election of Doug Ford, when now we see suddenly the rollback of sick days, basic necessities of things like the $15 minimum wage. You see that people are literally sacrificing their own young rather than actually share a tiny, any tiny piece of that power by those of us who are racialized outside of whiteness, who are outside of the gender norms, supporting the literal scorching of the earth to preserve this status. I think really represents to us the hollowness of what we are up against. To use the words of Norvisi Phillip, who describes this very well, I think these institutional practices and institutions that are morally repugnant, politically bankrupt, and spiritually dead. So I think that remembering that the status quo is, that there's this fear, I suppose, that the status quo is shifting, and this is because it has, right? Though we haven't gotten to anywhere that I would call winning, we haven't won at this point, but I think that despite ongoing structural harms, the work that has been done in the wake of the abolition of slavery, in the wake of global decolonization movements, the work, some of which is ours and much of which is the work of people before us, we need to remember that we actually have made racists afraid. And we need to continue to make racists afraid. Because however much they might want, we will not go back to the good old days in which Black people were enslaved and Indigenous peoples were forced into residential schools, or only white settlers were allowed into this country. So this fear is attempting to bring us all back. Yet I think it's very easy when we look at the choices that are being offered to refuse to let this happen again. We're all out here fighting for a different kind of possible world, and we're not the first to have to actually fight this, but we are really joining something that has been a centuries-long collective struggle. So, we're currently in this riding tide that the neo-Nazi, alt-right, white supremacist forces that are rightly being called emboldened But I think just to really just remind us that the power we have, which of course is the theme of Social Justice Week, is something that really is, and has for a long time instilled a significant kind of fear. And it reminds us, I think, not to shy away from the kind of world that we are trying to build, that's growing out of the struggles of those who came before us. We might not yet have freedom, but we're freedom-oriented.